Hello everybody. Today I'm going to show you how to create a custom dialog with wxWidgets. But before we get into that, let's clean up some of the code from the previous episode. Inside of the app.cpp file, we're going to get rid of this code here. And then we're going to go to mainwindow.cpp and we'll get rid of this. And we don't need this either. Okay, now we can create our custom dialog. To do that, we need to go to the Solution Explorer and we'll right click and then we'll go to Add Class. And today we're going to create a dialog that will allow the user to enter their mailing address. I'm going to call the dialog Address Dialog. And our dialog will need to inherit from the wxDialog class. Okay, now we'll need to go to the mainwindow.h file. And then we'll go to the top. And we'll copy the include directives. And we'll just add those to the top of our dialog class. And now we'll create a constructor. If we go to the wxDialog class, and then we select Go to Definition, we can copy the parameters. And paste them in. And let's copy this. And then we'll go to addressdialog.cpp and just paste it in. Now we need to call the wxDialog class and pass all of the parameters. And don't forget to remove the default parameters. And now we'll create a destructor. Inside the header file, we're going to create 4 data members. One for street, one for city, one for the zip code, and one for the state. We'll also need to create a getter for each of the data members. Now that we have our getters and data members set up, we can start creating our dialog. The first thing we'll need is a box sizer. I also want to set the minimum size of the dialog. And I'm going to set that to 400 by 100. And we'll also call fit. Now we'll add some buttons to our dialog. The create button sizer method just takes the IDs of the buttons we want to create. In this case, that's the OK button and the cancel button. The reason we use the create button sizer method instead of creating the buttons ourselves is because buttons are formatted differently depending on the operating system you're using. So it's easier to just let wxWidgets format the buttons for us. Okay, now that that's done, let's go ahead and create an instance of our dialog. So we'll go back to mainwindow.cpp and we'll go to the top and we'll include our dialog. We'll create our dialog inside of the onTest event handler. The first parameter will be the parent. The second parameter is the ID. And the third parameter is the title. Now we need to decide if we want to create a modal dialog or a non-modal dialog. Modal dialogs force the user to interact with the dialog. Non-modal dialogs don't. First, I'm going to show you how to create a modal dialog. All you have to do is call the showModal method. Normally, wxWidgets will delete our windows for us, but in the case of a modal dialog, we have to call destroy explicitly. The showModal method will return the ID of the button the user pressed. So we can use an if statement to check and see if the user pressed the OK button. If the user presses the OK button, we'll display the Dialogs data members. The wxString format method allows us to format a string with printf syntax. And now we can just use the getters we created to get the values of the data members. If you're not familiar with printf syntax, this %f symbol will be replaced with the value returned by the getStreet method. And this %s symbol will be replaced with the value of our getCity method, so on and so forth. So let's run that. And here you can see our custom dialog. If we move that aside and we try to interact with the parent window, you can see it won't let us. That's because a modal dialog forces us to interact with the dialog itself. And if we click the OK button, we'll get the message box we created, and it just displays the values stored in our dialog's data member. I should mention here that when it comes to modal dialogs, we don't have to create the dialog on the heap. We can create it on the stack. If you create your dialog on the stack, you don't have to call destroy. And that should work just fine. Okay, now let's go back to addressDialog.cpp and finish creating our dialog. We'll need to create another field so the user can enter the street. We'll create a label for the street field with the wxStatic text control. And I'm going to set the minimum size of the label. We'll set the width to 50. And we'll keep the height the same. And then we'll just add our label to the street sizer. And next we'll create a text control so the user can enter the street. But we'll create the control inside of addressDialog.h. So we're going to go to addressDialog.h. And in the private section, we're going to create a wxText control pointer. And then we just need to add the control to our street sizer. Okay, let's see what that looks like. Okay, we need to make a couple of changes. The first is I want this text control to stretch all the way over here to the right, and I want to put a border around it. We'll need to pass 1 to the append method. That will tell wxWidgets we want the text control to stretch, but we also need to tell it we want our sizer to stretch as well. And we do that by passing wxExpand. I also want to put a border around our sizer. So let's pass the wxAll flag. As well as a width for a border. Okay, that looks better. But I want these buttons to be over here on the right. Let's fix that now. We can move the buttons to the right by passing the wxAlignRight flag to the third parameter. Okay, now let's put a border around these buttons. We only need a border on the bottom of the buttons. Okay, that looks good. Now we need to do the same thing for the city field. So I'll just copy all of this. Okay, now let's take a look at that. We have a little bit too much space between these widgets. So let's change that. We only want a border around the left, the right, and the bottom of the widget. That looks better. And now we need to do the same thing for the zip code field. Okay, let's try that. Okay, that looks good, but I forgot to change the label. There, that looks better. And now we're going to add a control for the state field, but we're going to add that control right next to the control for the zip code field. So let's copy this. And for the state field, we're going to use the wxChoice control. The choice control is just a drop-down list. And we'll need to add the state control to the zip sizer. Couple of things we need to do. We need to change the label, and I want to add a little space here. That looks better, but our drop-down list is empty, so let's fix that. For this next part, we'll need a list of states and their abbreviations. So let's open up our browser. I'm not going to add all the states, but you can if you want to. Now I want to take a look at the wxChoiceControls constructor. So right-click on it and go to Definition. Here we can see that the constructor takes an array of strings. But if we scroll down, we can see there's a second constructor that takes an array string. And the array string is the fourth parameter, right after the wxPoint and wxSize. So we'll pass wxDefaultPosition and wxDefaultSize. And then we can pass our array string. Okay, let's run that. And now you can see we have our drop-down list. But you'll notice that this control is a little bit small. So let's fix that. That's better. Okay, now we want to create an event handler that will disable the OK button until the user fills out the dialog. So let's go back to our .h file. And at the bottom of our class, we'll add the declare event table macro. And then we'll go back to addressDialog.cpp. And at the top of the class, we'll add the begin event table and end event table macros. And now we'll need to go to the documentation for the wxUpdateUI event. Copy the event handler. Paste that into addressDialog.h. And we'll change the name to onUpdateOK button. And now we need to add the event macro to the event table. The ID is wxIDOK. And the function is our event handler. We'll have our OK button disabled by default. and we'll enable the OK button when the user enters all of the fields. GetValue will return a string, and we just want to know if the string is empty. And we'll do the same thing for the city field. The state field has to be handled a little bit differently. The getSelection method returns an index to the currently selected item, or wx not found if nothing is selected. If all of the fields are filled in, we'll enable the OK button. Our OK button is disabled. And if I fill in the fields, the OK button becomes enabled. And if I remove one of the fields, the OK button becomes disabled again. And now I need to show you how to transfer data to and from the window. We do that with the transfer data to window and transfer data from window methods. The transfer data to window method is called when we create our dialog. And the transfer data from window method is called when we click the affirmative button, which is usually the OK button. The transfer data to window method transfers data from our data members to the window. Setting the value on the state field has to be handled a little bit differently. First, we have to find the index of the string. We do that with the findString method. If we find a valid string, then we can call setSelection. And now when our dialog is created, you can see all of the fields are filled out automatically. These are all the values that were stored in our data members. And for the transfer data from window method, we have to do the exact opposite. We have to take the data that's stored in the window and transfer that to our data members. The getString method will convert the index to the string value. Okay, let's run that. So now if I change the value of these strings, we can see the updated values from the main window class. Okay, that's it for modal dialogs. Now I'm going to show you how to create a non-modal dialog. The non-modal version of our dialog needs to be created on the heap. So let's go to the mainwindow.h file. And we'll create a pointer for our dialog. We'll need to forward declare our address dialog class. Now we can go back to the main window.cpp file. And inside of our onTest event handler, we'll grab this code and we'll move it to the onHelp event handler. Before we dereference our pointer to the address dialog, we'll want to make sure the pointer isn't null. We don't need this if statement. If the pointer is null, we'll create an address dialog. And then we can just call the show method. The show method is similar to the showModal method, but the show method will create a non-modal dialog. Okay, so let's run that. If we click the help icon, nothing happens. That's because our pointer is null right now. And if we click on the test icon, a dialog will be created for us. Now if I click the help menu again, we can see the default values. And if we open the dialog again, but this time we'll change the values. When we go back to the help menu, we can see the values have changed. One last thing I want to point out is that with a non-modal dialog, you can still interact with the parent window. Okay, everybody, that's it for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.